The morning they summoned Cecily Morrow to give testimony in the matter of the late Duke of Ashmore's estate, she wore her best grey wool, and carried nothing but her gloves and the small leather-bound ledger she had kept, unasked, for 6 months in the bottom of her traveling trunk. Says she did not know precisely why she had brought the ledger today. She had told herself it was because she might need to reference the household dates, the entries her father had taught her to keep when she first came to assist him at Ashmore, the running record of domestic expenditure and supply that any well-ordered great house maintained. She had told herself many things since the previous August, and most of them had been half-true at best. Mr. Tewkesbury's offices occupied the ground floor of a sober grey building in the center of Whitmore, the market town 3 miles east of the Ashmore estate. The clerk who admitted Cecily to the waiting room said nothing about the ledger under her arm, and gestured her toward a straight-backed chair beside the window. Outside, the January street was cold and bright, the cobblestones rimed with frost. A pair of pigeons disputing something near the inn door opposite. Cecily set the ledger on her lap. She pressed her gloved hands flat against its cover. She was the second person to arrive. The first was already seated when she entered. He was a man she did not recognize, which was, she thought, not entirely surprising. She had spent 18 months at Ashmore attending the previous Duke's correspondence, and in that time she had been present at no formal dinners, no assemblies, no drawing-room entertainments. The late Duke had kept a small household and a smaller social calendar in his last years. She had met Penwarren, and Collins the steward, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Frost, and the physician, Dr. Pelham, and very few others. The man across the waiting room was perhaps 34 years of age. He sat with a particular quality of stillness she could not immediately name. His dark coat of excellent cut, his dark hair ordered, but not fashionably arranged, his attention fixed on a paper he held open across his knee. Say. He did not look up when she entered. He looked up approximately 7 seconds later, as though he had been waiting to see whether the arrival would resolve itself into something worth attention. Their eyes met. He did not look away at once, which was unusual. He said, "Miss Morrow," as though the name were something he had been holding in readiness. She said, "My lord," because she knew then who he was. Viscount Corwin. The heir the late Duke had never expected to need. The man who had inherited Ashmore and all its complications when the Duke died in October without a son, without a nephew, without anyone closer in the entail than a third cousin he had met twice. He looked at her hands at the ledger. His expression did not change in any way she could have described, but she had the sudden, strange sensation that she had brought something to this meeting he had not known to ask for. She pressed her hands flatter against the cover and said nothing more, and the solicitor's clerk appeared in the doorway and called them both inside. The ledger had belonged to the late Duke personally, separate from the official household accounts that Mr. Tewkesbury maintained. Cecily knew this because she had found it in the late Duke's private sitting room in late September, 3 weeks before he died, on a morning when she had gone to collect his correspondence and found him asleep in his chair, a cup of tisane cooling on the table beside him, and the small leather book, half open on the floor, as though it had slipped from his grip. She had picked it up. She had seen the entries inside. She had set it carefully on the writing table and left the room, and then she had come back for it the following day, and the day after, and the day he died. She had slid it into the pocket of her dark traveling coat and carried it home in her trunk without telling anyone, because she did not know then what she had or what it meant. Only that the late Duke had been keeping a private record of something she could not reconcile with anything she had been officially told. She was 24 years old. She had watched her father's employer die slowly over the course of 3 months. She had watched Aldous Penwarren, the late Duke's cousin, sit at every dinner, manage the household medicine cabinet, intercept the physician's notes, and smile at everyone who questioned him with the specific confidence of a man who knows he is the only person in possession of the relevant facts. She was not a physician. She was the secretary's daughter, come to assist her ailing father with the late Duke's correspondence. She had no authority and no standing, and no way to name what she suspected without destroying herself in the attempt. So she had taken the ledger home, and she had waited. Her father, Mr. Gerard Morrow, had served the late Duke of Ashmore as private secretary for 11 years before a chest ailment began to slow his hand in the spring of the previous year. It was Cecily who had come to assist him, first for a fortnight, then for a month, then for the full 18 months it had taken the late Duke's health to deteriorate past the point at which correspondence was a daily necessity. She had managed the letters, the estate communications, the responses to invitations. The Duke no longer had the strength to attend. She had been useful, and she had been invisible, which were, she had learned, very nearly the same thing at Ashmore. The Duke had been kind to her. He was a man of 71, slow in speech and careful in thought, with a particular fondness for the novels of Mrs. Radcliffe that Cecily had shared, and which had formed the whole of their personal conversation across 18 months. He had called her Miss Morrow. He had thanked her on several occasions for her accuracy. He had never spoken to her about his health, his heir, or his cousin Aldous. Aldous Penwarren had arrived at Ashmore in August of the previous year when the Duke's decline became publicly apparent. He was the son of the Duke's youngest sister, 40 years younger than the Duke himself, and he arrived with a great deal of charm and a great many questions about the estate's management that he framed as devoted familial concern. Collins the steward distrusted him at once, but could not have said precisely why. Cecily had watched Penwarren for 10 weeks before she understood that the thing she found most unsettling about him was his patience. He was never hurried. He was never anxious. He had arrived, knowing she now thought that he had time. The physician was called Dr. Pelham. He was a man of middling age and excellent reputation in the county, and he attended the Duke 3 times each week through August and September. In October, Dr. Fauché, Pelham told the household that the Duke's decline was consistent with advanced age, and a constitution weakened by years of gout. He signed the death certificate on the 15th of October and returned to his practice in Whitmore, and by the 1st of November, Ashmore had been quietly closed. Cecily had gone home to her father's house in the village of Holt Morrow, 4 miles west. She had unpacked her trunk. She had found the ledger. She had read it through twice, very slowly, and then she had wrapped it in brown paper and placed it beneath her winter shawls at the bottom of the trunk. And she had said nothing to anyone, because she was the secretary's daughter, and she had nothing but a dead man's private notes and a feeling that had no legal standing whatsoever. If you have stayed with this story so far, I think you already suspect what the ledger contained. Stay close. The next part is where it begins to matter. The Viscount Corwin summoned Cecily back to Ashmore in the 2nd week of January, 6 weeks after the first interview in Mr. Tewkesbury's office. But the formal invitation was delivered by a footman to her father's house, written on estate stationery, in a hand she did not recognize but which bore the new Duke's signet in the wax. It requested her presence at Ashmore on the 14th, in her capacity as a person familiar with the late Duke's household correspondence, to assist in the audit of certain estate records. The invitation noted that a carriage would be sent. She had not told anyone about the ledger. She had not told the Viscount about the ledger. She had not told Mr. Tewkesbury. She had answered the solicitor's questions in January with scrupulous accuracy about everything she had officially observed. She spoke of the late Duke's health, his correspondence practices, the staff she had known. She had answered no questions about the ledger because no one had asked. The carriage arrived at 8 in the morning. She put on her gray wool again. She put the ledger in her traveling bag, and then took it out again, and set it on her writing table. And then, on the threshold of her room, she went back and put it in the bag. Ashmore in January was very different from Ashmore in October. The house had been opened again, the dust sheets pulled from the furniture, the fires lit in the main rooms. Collins met her at the servants' entrance, which she had always used, and she saw in his face something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. "He's a good man," Collins said quietly, meaning the new Duke. "Asks the right questions." Aldous Penwarren was in the hall when they came through to the main house. He was dressed finely, Cecily noted, and he smiled at her with the particular warmth of a man who considers himself unthreatened. "Miss Morrow," he said, "the secretary's daughter. I would not have thought they needed you specifically." She met his eyes and said nothing, and followed Collins to the library. The Viscount was already there, standing at the long table where the estate records had been laid out in orderly rows. He looked up when she entered and said, "Miss Morrow, thank you for coming." He gestured to the chair across the table from him. It was a gesture, she noted, rather than a command, which she had not entirely expected. The audit continued for 4 hours. He asked careful questions, the kind that circled a point from 3 directions before arriving at it directly. She answered them. She knew a useful witness. Having managed the correspondence for 18 months, she knew which letters went where, she knew the late Duke's handwriting from Penwarren's, she knew which accounts had been kept by the house, and which by the steward, and which were the Duke's own private concern. It was at 2 in the afternoon that she found the discrepancy. It was in the medicine records, which were officially maintained by the housekeeper, Mrs. Frost. The official record showed that the Duke's medicinal tincture, prescribed by Dr. Brusselli, Pelham for his gout, had been dispensed in consistent quantities across August and September, and the entries were signed by Mrs. Frost in her clear round hand. The false entry was in the supplementary column. A different tincture, marked as approved by the late Duke himself, signed not by Mrs. Frost, but by Penwarren, in a hand that was almost but not quite consistent with the other entries. Cecily did not say anything. She turned the record toward herself very slightly, took up the pen that lay beside the inkwell, and made a small marginal note in the corner of the page. She wrote the date and the initial P and a question mark. She did not know that the Viscount had been watching her. She did not know it until he said, from across the table, his voice low and quite steady, "What did you find?" She looked up. His eyes were on hers. He had the particular stillness again, the quality she had noticed in Mr. Tewkesbury's office. He was a man entirely at rest, who was also entirely alert. She hesitated for 2 seconds. Then she turned the record fully toward him and said, "This entry is in a different hand from the others in this column, and the tincture it records was not in any dispensary receipt I ever filed." He looked at the entry. He looked at her. He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "I have suspected since September. I have known since I read the late Duke's private ledger." The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of a man taking in the full weight of what he has just been told and choosing not to waste either of their time on a dramatic reaction. He said, "You have the ledger." She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "Bring it tomorrow." Cecily Morrow did not sleep that night, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the quality of her wakefulness. For 6 months her sleeplessness had had the texture of fear. This was different. This was the particular alertness of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for too long, and has finally set it down within sight of someone capable of bearing it with her. She arrived at Ashmore the following morning with the ledger in her bag, and Collins let her in through the same entrance, and she went to the library, and the Viscount was already there. She set the ledger on the table without preamble. He did not reach for it at once. He looked at her first, which she had not expected, and said, "Before I read this, is there anything you want me to understand before I read it?" She considered this carefully, because it was a careful question. She said, "The late Duke was keeping a record of his own symptoms. He was also keeping a record of what he was given and when I think he knew something was wrong. I think he was gathering evidence in the only way available to him, and I think he died before he could act on it." The Viscount opened the ledger. He read for 40 minutes, which was, she thought, appropriate to its weight. When he looked up, his face had the quality of a man who has confirmed something he had hoped not to confirm. He said, "My sister died 6 years ago. The physician who attended her missed what was causing her to deteriorate. By the time anyone looked in the correct direction, it was too late. I spent 2 years afterward asking how a man of training and intelligence could miss what was plainly in front of him." He paused. "The answer, I eventually concluded, was that he did not wish to see it. seeing it would have been inconvenient. She said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. He said, "I see you did not wish to be inconvenienced either, Miss Morrow. And yet here you are. Here it is." It was the closest he came, in that conversation, to acknowledging what her presence cost her. She did not stay long after that. He thanked her. He said he would send for her again. She gathered her gloves and her bag, and she was at the library door when he said, "Miss Morrow." She turned. He said, "You could have discarded this. You would have been entirely safe." She said, "Yes." He said nothing more. When she turned to go, she was aware, still, of his eyes on her, and the quality of that attention was unlike anything she had known from any room she had ever stood in. That evening, Mrs. Me. Priscilla Vane came to call on Cecily's nearest neighbor, Mrs. Horton, and was seen driving back through Holt Morrow in a very fine carriage. Mrs. Horton mentioned at her next morning call that Mrs. Vane had been asking about Cecily's situation, her father's health, and the nature of her connection to the new Duke. Mrs. Horton, who was fond of Cecily, reported this with concern and without embellishment. "She called you the secretary's daughter," Mrs. Horton said. Several times she seemed to think this was explanatory of something. The weeks that followed carried a particular alternating rhythm. Cecily was called to Ashmore every few days. The Viscount was working through the household records systematically, and he required her assistance in interpreting the late Duke's correspondence, and, increasingly, the late Duke's private notations in the ledger, which formed a kind of shadow account of the household's last 3 months. Each session lasted 3 or 4 hours. Each session ended with the same quality of leave-taking, precise, correct, and charged with something neither of them named. He had a manner of standing when she arrived that she gradually came to recognize as something other than mere courtesy. He stood because he had heard her come in, and he had heard her because he had been listening for her. She told herself she was imagining this. She told herself she was a woman of practical intelligence who had no business constructing significance from the way a man stood. Her body disagreed. When he was near, within the radius of a few feet, she was aware of exactly where his hands were on the table, of the slight lowering of his voice when he was not addressing the records, but addressing her. Once, reaching for the same document, their fingers very nearly met across the ledger's open page, and she felt her breath hold in a way that had nothing to do with the cold library air. He noticed. She was almost certain he noticed, because his hand stilled for half a second before withdrawing. He said nothing. He returned his attention to the records, and in the silence that followed he asked her, with a slight difference in register, whether her father's health was improved. "Yes," she said, "the weather has been milder." "Good," he said, and there was something in the word, in the level brevity of it, that was not primarily about the weather at all. Penwarren, meanwhile, was consolidating his position. He had made himself useful to the new Duke in practical ways. He knew the local tenants, the estate's traditions, the customs. Collins could not be bothered to explain twice. He attended the small dinner the Viscount hosted for the county's magistrates in early February, and Cecily was not present at that dinner, but she heard from Collins afterward that Penwarren had been very charming and very concerned with the new Duke's social reputation, and very quietly dismissive of any suggestion that the previous Duke's death warranted. Further inquiry at that dinner, in the presence of the county magistrates, a visiting solicitor, and Mrs. By. Vane Penwarren had raised his glass to the late Duke, a man who was regrettably surrounded in his final months by persons of uncertain loyalty. He had not looked at anyone in particular. He had not needed to. Mrs. Sabelis. Vane had visited Cecily's father's house 2 days later on a pretext of neighborly civility and mentioned in the course of an otherwise pleasant call that it was such a pity when younger women without independent means placed themselves in ambiguous positions, in great houses, and that one could not always trust to the generosity of persons of rank in such matters. Cecily had thanked her for the call and shown her out. What she did not know, until Collins told her the following week, was that Penwarren had sent a letter to Mr. Tewkesbury in the 3rd week of February. The letter stated that certain household documents appeared to have gone missing from Ashmore at the time of the previous Duke's death, and that it was the belief of Mr. Furtz. Penwarren, as the late Duke's nearest surviving male relative, that the most probable explanation was a dishonest removal by a person who had been in proximity to the Duke's private rooms. The letter did not name Cecily. It did not need to. There was only one person who had been in those rooms, and was not still in the household's employ. Collins told Cecily about the letter on a Thursday morning, in the stable yard, speaking quietly, with his back to the house. He said, "You should know. He's told the Viscount." She said, "Has the Viscount believed it?" Collins did not answer at once. Then he said, "He has not sent for you." She walked home. She was careful about the ice on the lane, which had not yet thawed in the shadow of the old mill wall. She counted her steps without meaning to, which was a habit she had formed in the months at Ashmore, when counting had been a way to stay inside her own body, rather than inside the fear. She did not allow herself to think about it until she was inside and the door was closed, and then she sat down at her father's writing table and pressed her hands flat on the surface, and she understood clearly that this was the shape she had always feared. The thing she had been carrying had been a kind of power. She now saw not her own power, but the power of evidence, and it had felt like safety, as long as no one had thought to question how she came to have it. The moment Penwarren named her as a thief, the evidence became the indictment. She would be discredited before she could be heard, and that the ledger would be taken from her and reinterpreted, and that she would have no standing and no recourse, and nothing left but the knowledge of what she knew. Her father found her there an hour later. He said nothing, which was like him. He set a cup of tea on the table beside her, and went to sit in his chair by the fire, and after a while he said, "Whatever it is you have been carrying, Cecily, it has made you very quiet for 6 months," she said. "I know," he said. "Whatever you do, do not put it down for the wrong reasons." She thought about this for a long time. 2 weeks passed. Cecily received no word from Ashmore. She taught her music pupils. She managed her father's household. She did not go to any assembly, because she could not afford the expenditure of attending one, and then standing through the evening, being visibly ignored by persons who had decided what she was. On the first day of March, a letter arrived from Mr. Tewkesbury's office. It was not addressed to Cecily. It was addressed to her father, formally, and it stated that in accordance with a codicil attached to the late Duke's will, a formal reading of said codicil would take place at Tewkesbury & Sons offices on the 12th of March, and that the persons named in the late Duke's private correspondence as witnesses to certain household matters were cordially requested to attend. The letter listed 6 names. Cecily's was among them. She read it twice. Then she took the ledger from beneath the winter shawls in the bottom of her trunk. She unwrapped it from its brown paper. She set it on the writing table where she could see it while she thought. The late Duke had known. He had been keeping his own record in those last weeks, and he had been doing so because he had suspected what was being done to him. And he had known that, by the time anyone understood it, he would not be there to explain. He had left evidence in the only form available to him. It was a private ledger, and a codicil written in private with Tewkesbury that referenced the ledger by description and directed that it be sought. He had trusted that someone would find it worth keeping. He had been right. She thought about the Viscount. She thought about the stillness in his face when he read, and his sister in the ground 6 years, and his voice saying, "You could have discarded this." She thought for the first time in 6 months that perhaps she was not entirely alone in this room. The 12th of March arrived, gray and dry without rain, but with a cold that held to the stone buildings and the cobblestones all morning. Cecily arrived at Mr. Tewkesbury's offices at 10:15. Collins was already there, in his good coat, his hat in his hands. Dr. Pelham arrived shortly after and stood against the wall, with the expression of a man awaiting a verdict he has begun to suspect may not favor him. Mrs. Strav. Vane arrived at 20 past, very finely dressed, and looked at Cecily once, and away again. Penwarren arrived at 10:30. He was perfectly composed. He had not, Cecily thought, begun to understand what a codicil referencing the late Duke's private papers actually implied. He bowed to everyone generally, and said something pleasant about the weather and took the chair that placed him directly across the table from Mr. Tewkesbury. The Viscount arrived at 25 minutes to 11. He entered without particular announcement, and Collins stood, and Dr. Pelham stood, and Penwarren's composure shifted very slightly at the edges, the way a candle flame shifts when a door is opened across a room. The Viscount's eyes found Cecily. He gave no other sign of acknowledgement. Mr. Tewkesbury opened the codicil. It had been executed in the first week of October, 3 weeks before the late Duke's death. It was witnessed, Tewkesbury confirmed, by 2 witnesses whose identities he was not at liberty to disclose, but whose reliability he would stake his professional reputation upon. The codicil stated in the precise and measured language the late Duke had favored, that he had reason to believe his health was being influenced by human agency rather than by natural decline, that he had maintained a private record of his symptoms and the alterations in his medication in a small leather-bound ledger kept in his private sitting room, that this ledger was bequeathed to whoever among my household shall present it, understanding that its contents constitute the evidence I was unable to present in person. The room was very quiet. Mr. Tewkesbury looked up from the document. He said, "Does any person present wish to produce such a document?" Penwarren said nothing. His stillness was different from the Viscount's. Where the Viscount's was settled, Penwarren's had become rigid, the stillness of a man who has stopped breathing while he calculates. Cecily reached into her traveling bag. She set the ledger on the table. Penwarren said, "That is a household document that was removed without authorization from Ashmore. Miss Morrow took it upon her departure without leave. I have already communicated this to the solicitor in writing, and I should note that the testimony of a person who is admitted to removing documents from the premises is of limited credibility." No one responded to this immediately. The Viscount stood. He was at the far end of the table. He did not hurry. He crossed the room in 3 measured strides, and he stood beside Cecily's chair, and he placed his hand on the back of it, not on her but at her shoulder's height, a declaration of proximity, as clear as any formal statement. He said, in a voice that was entirely level, "Miss Morrow brought me the truth. She will be my Duchess." The sentence landed in the silence with the weight of something irreversible. Mrs. Vane made a small sound. "Doctor." Pelham's expression shifted to something that was, quite plainly, relief. Penwarren's calculation failed him at last, and for a moment his face showed something that was neither charm nor confidence, but only the blankness of a man who has arrived at the end of his prepared text. "Mr. Bury." Tewkesbury looked at the Viscount. He looked at Cecily. He looked at the ledger. He said, "Very good, my lord. I will accept the ledger as presented." He glanced at Penwarren. "The contents of this document, if they concern the administration of medicines to the late Duke, will of course be subject to further examination by the appropriate county authority. I would counsel, Penwarren, that you secure a proper legal representation before that examination begins." Penwarren said nothing. He was, for the first time Cecily had ever observed, simply quiet. The room did not erupt. It settled. It settled the way a room settles after a storm has passed through, without breaking anything irreparably, the air stilled, and the candles steady, and the documents still on the table. Collins behind her exhaled once, slowly, Mrs. Plan. Vane gathered herself and looked at nothing in particular. Dr. Pelham, who had known for 3 months that something was wrong, and had not had the courage to say so, looked at the floor. The Viscount looked at Cecily. She looked back at him. She was conscious of her own heartbeat, and of the table's edge beneath her hand, and of the ledger lying open before Mr. Sambley. Tewkesbury, and of the way the Viscount's eyes, very dark in the grey morning light from the window, held hers without any of the social hesitation she had come to associate with men who had just done something definitive, and were waiting for it to be acknowledged. He was not waiting for acknowledgement. He was simply there, as he had been since January, still and alert and looking at the thing in front of him. She said, very quietly, "My lord," he said, equally quietly. "James." It was the first time. The single word, her first name's counterpart, His given name offered in a public room without any of the formal scaffolding that ought to have surrounded it, and no one in the room was looking at them except Collins, who looked quickly at the wall. She said James, and her voice was entirely steady, which she noted with some distant part of herself as improbable, given that the rest of her was not steady at all. What came after was procedural, in the way that all consequential things eventually become procedural. Mr. Tewkesbury retained the ledger and began the process of conveying its contents to the appropriate county justice. Pelham, when called upon privately in the weeks following, provided a supplementary statement that revised his assessment of the late Duke's final illness in terms that were, Cecily thought, as honest as he was capable of being when honesty cost him something. Penmorn was questioned. He engaged legal counsel, as Tewkesbury had advised. The outcome was slow and careful and largely private, in the manner of such things in this period, and it was not the story's point. The story's point was simply this: a man who had been patient and meticulous and certain of his own invisibility had miscalculated the precise nature of what he could not see. He had not counted on an old duke's steady private grief, or on a 24-year-old woman's decision to carry a ledger home in a traveling trunk because it seemed wrong to leave it, or on the new duke's particular gift for asking the questions that other people had decided were inconvenient. Ashmore in late March was a different house from Ashmore in January. The fires were lower and the windows could be opened, and the early afternoon light came through the library windows at an angle that was entirely unlike anything Cecily had known of the house in the months of the previous autumn. She had not expected to return here. She had not expected to walk through the main door rather than the servant's entrance, or to have Collins bow rather than merely nod, or to hear, from the garden, the sound of children she did not recognize who were apparently the new Duke's wards from a distant branch of the family. James was in the library when she arrived, and he did not put down what he was reading at once, which she had come to understand was not discourtesy, but simply the habit of a man who trusted her not to require it. She sat down across from him. She was, she supposed, still getting accustomed to sitting rather than waiting to be directed somewhere. "Your father," he said without looking up. It was a question shaped like a statement. "Better," she said. "The spring has helped him." He looked up then. He looked at her, in the manner she had been gradually, across 2 months, allowing herself to look back at. Not the careful professional attention of a witness interview, but the simpler and more alarming attention of a man who was looking at her because he preferred it to looking at anything else. She said, "You were certain it was in that ledger before you ever saw it." He considered this. He said, "I was certain something was wrong. I was not certain what. I was, however, certain that you knew what it was, from the first interview." She said, "You gave no sign." He said, "I gave you time. There is a difference." She understood this to be true. She understood, sitting in the library with the spring light coming through the windows, that James Halcott was a man who had learned the hard way that systems closed ranks and facts required patience, and the correct question was frequently the one no one had yet thought to ask. She understood that his coldness was the scar of a particular education, and that the thing beneath it had always been something else entirely. He set down his papers. He came around the table, which was something he had not done before in this room, and he stopped beside her chair, and she looked up at him. And he was close enough that she could see the faint lines beside his eyes, the ones that came from squinting into the particular quality of English outdoor light on days when a man was reading boundary markers in the field. He said, "Miss Morrow." She said, "Cecily." He repeated it, "Cecily." Her name in his voice was a different thing from her name in anyone else's, and she had known it would be since the morning in February, when she had first consciously understood that she was listening for him. She was not certain she had a great deal of dignity left to protect on that point. So he reached out and took her hand, which was not gloved, because she had set her gloves on the table when she sat down, and his hand was warm, and he held hers in the formal clasp that was, in every relevant proprietary sense, entirely correct, and was also entirely not sufficient for what she felt at the contact. He said, "The ledger has been transferred to Tewkesbury's formal record." She said, "I know." He said, I should like you to understand that my proposal this afternoon was not made in the heat of the moment." She said, "January was not this afternoon." He permitted himself. Then the smallest change of expression, not a smile precisely, but the precursor of one. The thing that came before the mask admitted it could afford to move. He said, "January was not this afternoon." She thought briefly and clearly of the late Duke in his private sitting room with his failing hand and his careful ledger, and of her father at his writing table, and of Collins in the stable yard speaking quietly with his back to the house. She thought of herself in the gray wool coat carrying a book of evidence, because it seemed wrong to leave it behind. The ledger was on the archive shelf now, transferred to official custody, but retained at Ashmore as part of the estate's permanent record. She had seen it there when she came in. It was a small square of dark leather, ordinary in its appearance, carrying its weight only to those who knew what weight it had. James brought her hand to his mouth and held his lips against her knuckles for a moment that was brief and exact and warm. Then he stepped back and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the spring afternoon held them both in its particular light, ordinary and generous and sufficient. If the late Duke, in whatever quiet place he had arrived at, could see the library that had been his working room through 11 Michaelmasses and 3 serious illnesses, she thought he might be satisfied, not triumphal. Satisfied, in the way that a man is satisfied when the account has been put in order, and the correct entries confirmed, and the record is, at last, accurate. She stayed for another hour. They worked through the household correspondence that required her knowledge of the late Duke's habits and the abbreviations he had used in his private notations. It was useful work, and she did it well. And he thanked her at the end of it, in the way he always had, precisely and without inflation. At the door, he said, "Next week?" She said yes. She went down the steps, and Collins was there to open the carriage door, and the afternoon light came through the window as they drove west along the lane to Holt Morrow. And she set her gloves in her lap and looked out at the greening hedgerows, and she thought about the ledger on the archive shelf, and her name in James Halkett's voice, and the specific quality of his hand, holding hers. The carriage pulled into the yard at her father's house as the clock struck 4. Her father was at the window, and he raised a hand when he saw her, and she raised one in return, and she felt, going in through the door, the particular warmth of a house that has been worried on her behalf, and was now somewhat relieved. Her father did not ask questions. He set the kettle on and sat in his chair, and she sat across from him, and after a while he said, "Well." She said well. He looked at her face for a moment. He said, "Good." She picked up the cup he had poured for her. Outside the window the lane was quiet, and the hedgerows were the new pale green of March. And somewhere up the lane, if she had looked, she could have seen the chimneys of Ashmore against the sky. She did not need to look. She knew where it was. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. If Cecily's courage moved you, leave a word for her in the comments.